The human frontline became total hell. One alien survivor speaks out. The boot was still laced. Perfect double knot, clean sole except for the mud on one edge, sitting just inside the threshold of their field station as if someone had placed it there with care, completely separated from the person who had tied it that morning. I stood over it. I counted my own seconds, 42 of them, and in my official field log I wrote, human equipment. Notable. I want the record to reflect that I believed what I had been told before anything else. I want that stated clearly. I believed the intelligence analyst with the calm hands and the precise holographic projections. I believed the grade classification. I believed on the transport that carried me to forward station Kel that I was flying toward a species in its final stage of resistance. The analyst's briefing had been thorough. Grade C threat classification. Low physical endurance relative to Keth. Standard, high emotional volatility. Under sustained pressure, poor unit cohesion when supply lines failed. She had used one phrase that I wrote in the margins of my deployment notes, and I remember it exactly because I read it back to myself on the transport. She said they break along psychological fault lines. She did not say this as a prediction. She said it as a description of something already in progress. I wrote it down. This is documented. Forward station, Kel sat 3 km behind the human-held ridge. The Keth commanders. They were the kind of officers who had stopped worrying. I recognized the posture, loose movement, unhurried speech, the practiced ease of people managing a conclusion they had already reached. The humans had been holding the ridge for 11 days. The projection gave them 6 more before complete collapse. The commanders offered me food when I arrived. Their mood was that of people waiting for something scheduled. I walked the supply lines toward the front. The smell came first. 11 days of sustained stress produces something in the human body that my species had never needed to document. I gave it a field designation and kept moving. The sounds came second. I had expected silence in Keth doctrine. Units reaching the end of their resistance go quiet. The noise leaves them first. I had observed this in 3 prior engagements. Silence is the signature of a thing that has finished deciding. From 300 m behind the human forward positions I heard laughter. Not the thin reflexive kind, full laughter, the kind that travels from one person to the next like a spark finding dry material. I stopped walking. I checked my audio sensors. They registered normal function. I kept walking. The field station ahead of me had taken fire. The eastern wall showed it. The roof had been partially repaired with whatever was available, and the repair held. 2 humans outside the entrance were playing a card game on supply crates with the focused attention of people who had nowhere more urgent to be. Inside the station, the wounded were being treated. That was when I filed my first discrepancy report to Sovereignty Command. The exact language is on record, and I want to read it because the careful wording still does not capture the thing I was actually observing. The report states, casualties at this station are ambulatory at rates inconsistent with documented injury severity. What that means is this: a man with a substantial wound to his side was sitting upright on a medical cot, eating from a container with one hand, using the other to make his point. in an argument with the medic treating him. The argument was about whether his current injury classification permit him to return to the forward line. He believed it did. The medic believed it did not. The man was winning. Not because his logic was airtight, but because somewhere before the argument started, he had already decided how it ended. The medic, I think, sensed this. The man went back to the line. I turned a slow circle in the middle of that station. I took in every face, every pair of hands still moving, still doing the next necessary thing. I was building what my training called a data portrait of a unit in late stay attrition. The data portrait kept generating error flags. That was when I saw the boot. I stood over it for 42 seconds. I will not describe it further. I will only say that the room around me was full of humans who should, by every model I carried, have been past the point of coherent function. And in those 42 seconds, something moved through me that I had no field designation for. I made one up. Calibration anomaly. I transmitted my initial assessment to Sovereignty Command that evening. The transmission stated human morale consistent with late-stage attrition. Projected collapse within standard parameters. I sent it. I believed it when I wrote it. I want that on record. I want the Commission to understand the specific quality of my confidence at that moment. I believed it the way you believe something when an alternative requires too much to look at directly. My species has a precise term for this kind of reasoning, 6 syllables. Technically accurate. The humans have shortened the same concept to 2 letters. I understand now why they made it that compact. When you need a word that often, you do not want it to be slow. The morning of my 4th day on the human line, a sergeant named Owen Garrett ran towards something that was actively trying to harm him. Not because the math favored it, not because his retreat was cut off, not because any calculation of survival probability pointed in that direction. He ran toward it because, in his own words delivered to me afterward while a medic worked on his shoulder, it had made him angry. I am getting ahead of the timeline. This is what happens when I try to describe the 4th day. The image arrives before the sequence does. Let me return to the beginning of it. I was assigned to 3rd Squad, 14th Human Expeditionary Force on the morning of my 3rd day. The assignment came from my sovereignty supervisors, who found the arrangement faintly amusing. Observer, they called it. What is there to observe? The humans have been holding one ridge for nearly 2 weeks. They are nearly finished holding it. Go watch, file your reports, come back when it is over. The squad received me with the kind of practical acceptance that I would later understand was how they received most things they had not asked for. Protective vest was produced. I was told to stay low and to avoid standing in front of anyone. A call sign was assigned to me by a man named Cal Reeves, who looked at my open field log, looked at me and said, "The accountant." I did not understand the reference at the time. I was introduced to the full unit. Owen Garrett, the sergeant, a man built in the way that makes you understand certain decisions before he speaks single word. Cal Reeves, second in command, with a face that was almost never serious. Nina Fletcher, who had the fastest reading of any species I have ever observed in any species. Pete Hollies, the oldest in the unit, who spoke less than everyone and noticed More than anyone. Danny Ward, the youngest, who asked me 3 questions in the first 5 minutes and did not seem to find any of my answers satisfying. I cataloged them using Keth assessment. Metrics, projected combat effectiveness. Hours remaining, psychological. Resilience index, physiological capacity. Under sustained stress. 2 of them by my models should already have been unable to function at any meaningful level. 1 of them was making a hot drink from powder and heated water and arguing about whether it tasted good. The argument continued for some time. Nobody resolved it. I noted the exchange and moved on. What I did not note and what I should have noted as the first significant data point of my entire observation assignment was the way they moved around each other. The constant small contact, Garrett resting a hand briefly on Danny's shoulder as he passed him, Cal hitting Nina on the arm when she said something I had not processed quickly enough. I initially flagged this as a possible low-level aggression event, and then revised the flag within seconds. Because Nina laughed. Pete sitting in near total silence beside Cal while both of them cleaned their equipment close enough that they were almost touching, saying nothing to each other and somehow communicating the entire time. I cataloged this as human proximity. Behavior function unclear. I revised that entry many times over the following weeks. I eventually deleted the words function unclear and replaced them with something that took me considerably longer to find the right language for. But that came later. The contact came before dawn on the 4th day. A Keth probing unit, a flanking attempt. Disciplined and by the standard doctrine pushed into the human position. From the east, my training responded. Cleanly, I moved to a covered position and opened my log. I began building the tactical picture. Rate of fire, engagement vector, human. Response time from first contact to organized return. 11 seconds, first contact to organized return fire. I wrote this down and underlined it, which is not something I typically do. Garrett took a round to his shoulder 20 minutes into the engagement. In Keth doctrine, this is a specific trigger point, a unit leader sustaining a significant injury initiates structured staged withdrawal. The injured leader transfers command. The unit preserves its remaining effectiveness by pulling back to a defensible secondary position. This is rational. This is how you protect what remains of the asset. I watched Garrett register the hit. I watched him look at his shoulder. I watched his face move through something I do not have a precise translation for. He moved forward. My tactical model did not generate an error flag because the error was so foundational that the model had no category built for it. The model was constructed on the assumption that pain signals withdrawal. This is a consistent biological response across 17 cataloged species. It was not consistent here. The other 4 members of the squad watched Garrett go forward. Something passed through them in the span of less than 2 seconds. I measured it in the only way available to me, by watching their bodies. The biochemical indicators for fear were elevated and clear and then layered directly on top of the fear without displacing it. Something else appeared. They followed him. The Cath flanking unit, larger, fresher, holding every tactical advantage my training said was decisive, broke contact and withdrew. I sat in my covered position for a long moment. I opened my log. Human unit executed tactically. Non-standard advance following command. Injury, I wrote. Outcome enemy. Withdrawal cause undetermined. I had never used the word undetermined. In a field assessment, it was not a word. My training had equipped me to use it. Implied that the model had been shown data it could not integrate. The model had been shown data it could not integrate. After the engagement ended and the position was confirmed clear, Garrett sat down against the supply container, while Nina worked on his shoulder, without being asked and without saying anything about it, which was the kind of efficiency the two of them had developed. Without apparently discussing it, he reached inside his chest armor and pulled out a small laminated square. He looked at it, he put it back. I had seen him do this several times already. I had cataloged it each time without understanding what I was looking at. I asked him what it was. He held it out. Two small humans, young ones, a building. Behind them, a tree to the left bare of leaves in the particular way that means a specific cold season. Both of the small humans were grinning in the open, unguarded way that appears to be available only to very young members of the species before whatever removes that expression takes it. My kids, Garrett said, I keep them close. It reminds me what I'm holding. The line for. I looked at the photograph. I looked at it for longer than necessary. I told myself I was documenting. I handed it back. I opened my log. I typed his words down verbatim. Then I sat there reading them back. By every framework my training had provided, I had achieved the intelligence objective of understanding human combat motivation, attachment to offspring, extension of survival instinct, a standard cross-species analysis applicable and filed. I had the explanation. I sat with it and felt, with a clarity, that the explanation did not account for that the explanation was missing something the size of a continent. My final log entry for that night reads, further analysis required. It is the least accurate sentence I wrote in 60 days. The resupply convoy did not arrive. I learned about this the way I learned about most things during those weeks. Too late to adjust before the reality had already moved past me. The convoy had been hit at an interdiction point along the supply route. No casualties on the human side, I was told, but the supplies were gone, and the next window was 3 days out. I ran the numbers automatically without deciding to. Caloric intake per individual per day, projected against available reserves. Water reclamation rates from the field. Equipment, ammunition drawdown against expected contact frequency. The picture came together clearly. I went to Garrett and presented the analysis. He listened to all of it. He looked at the numbers. He nodded slowly in the deliberate way he processed things that required more than one layer of thought. Yeah, he said, we're going to be fine. I checked my calculations again, twice. The calculations did not change. We were not, by any metric I could produce, going to be fine. We were going to remain functional for approximately 40 hours before the degradation curve began, affecting unit performance in measurable ways. Garrett had already moved to the next thing he needed to do. I stood there with my numbers and the word fine, trying to locate the logical bridge between them. I did not find it. What I found over the following 2 days was something I had no existing category for. The rationing system. I observed it first as a logistical process, then I reviewed the data I had filed and realized that what I had described was functionally incoherent. From an efficiency standpoint, then I looked at it from a different angle, and it produced a different kind of coherence entirely, one that had nothing to do with efficiency and everything to do with something my field manual did not cover. The distribution hierarchy ran backward. In KATH, units operating under supply stress, the hierarchy is functional. The highest priority personnel receive the maximum available resources because those resources produce the greatest return in preserved unit capability. This is rational. This is the asset protection principle. In this unit, the highest capability individuals were actively working to receive less. Arguments broke out, and I used the word loosely because these were quiet and insistent in the way of two people who both believe the other deserves the thing more. Cal Reeves gave his protein ration to Pete Hollies, who had a recurring joint condition that worsened in cold and damp conditions. Pete attempted to give it back. Cal declined with the finality of someone who had made the decision before the conversation started. Pete ate it. Cal ate a compressed nutrition block that my sensors assessed as having a caloric profile you would accept only when the alternative was nothing at all. He said it was not that bad, actually. I cataloged this interaction 8 times across 2 days, not because I expected new data from the repetition. I kept returning to it because something in writing it down again felt important. The way you reread a sentence that is clearly significant before you understand why. I understood it eventually. I was documenting something my species has a word for in historical texts but rarely encounters in active field conditions, without strategy, without calculation, without any apparent awareness that they were doing something that required documentation. They were choosing each other, not because it improved the unit's measurable outcomes, not because the mathematics supported it, because letting someone else carry a heavier load when you could take part of it was not something they were willing to do. I did not write this assessment in my log. I did not know how to write it without it sounding like something had malfunctioned in my evaluation protocols. On the second night of the shortage, I could not reach my rest state. My species does not sleep the way humans do, but we have a recovery cycle that functions similarly, and I could not enter it. I walked to the forward watch position. Nina Fletcher was there. She was looking out at the dark in the focused, patient way she applied to everything, as if she had decided the dark deserved her full attention, even when the dark offered nothing back. She did not comment on my presence. This was something I had come to appreciate about her. Nina had a precise understanding of when speech added value and when it did not. I sat near her. I told myself it was better than being alone with my numbers. After a while I asked her something. I ask it now with the hindsight of someone who understands what they were walking into, but did it anyway. I asked, "Are you afraid of dying?" She did not answer immediately. She considered it. Her whole body shifted slightly, the way humans move when the thinking is not confined to the part above their shoulders. "Yes," she said. A pause. "But I'm more afraid of..." She stopped. There are people who need me to come back, she said, so I waited. So I said. She turned and looked at me with an expression I have spent a considerable amount of time since trying to describe accurately. It was not impatience, it was not the expression of someone explaining something obvious. It was closer to the expression of someone who had arrived at the edge of a thing that did not translate and was deciding whether to try anyway. I don't really get a choice about being scared, she said. I already made the other choice. I processed this sentence. I processed it for a long time sitting in the dark. My training in combat psychology covers the role of fear in unit decision-making in considerable detail. The literature spans several hundred cycles of study. The consistent finding across nearly every source is that the reduction of fear improves performance. Remove the fear variable and the unit functions more cleanly. Nina Fletcher was not describing the removal of fear. She was describing something that existed alongside fear and simply refused to be governed by it, a decision made before the fear arrived so that when the fear arrived it found the position already occupied and had nowhere to go. I opened my log that night to file what should have been a standard discrepancy report. I sat looking at the blank document. I closed it without writing a single word. Later that night, I gave Garrett my emergency ration pack. I recorded this in my log as tactical resource reallocation. I knew exactly what I was doing. I knew exactly why I was not calling it what it was. The Sovereign Supreme Command issued the advance order on the 4th day of the shortage. 6 battalions, full forward push at first light. The operational assessment stated that the human position on the ridge would be overrun by mid-morning. The analysis supporting this assessment was thorough. It was well sourced. The people who prepared it were intelligent and working from good data. I read it the night before the advance. Then I walked back to where 3rd Squad was positioned and told myself this was for observation purposes. Garrett looked at me when I arrived, long and quiet. You probably should not be here for this, he said. I am an observer, I said. He considered that. He seemed to be deciding whether to say the thing he was thinking or let it rest. He let it rest. Stay low, accountant, he said. I stayed. At first light, 6 battalions moved. What followed does not live in my memory as a sequence with clean transitions between events. It exists as fragments, each one complete, each one separate. The way things sometimes break cleanly. When they break, a radio in the corner of the nearest shelter playing something nobody had turned it off. I did not turn it off. The song was one I did not know the name of then and have not been able to identify since. Nina running the resupply line between positions in the low, fast movement of someone whose body had learned the path so thoroughly that the brain was free for other things. Pete Holly's at the eastern position, operating with a thoroughness that came from somewhere below the level of conscious effort, completely present, completely quiet. Danny Ward, who had found none of my early answers satisfying, asking no questions now, just working, just being part of the thing that needed doing. Cal Reeves in continuous motion, reloading, repositioning, checking on each member of the squad in a rotation that never stopped and never seemed to tire. And Garrett with the shoulder that was not fully healed, directing the defense with. His voice entirely level, the levelness was the detail I could not stop. Registering, it was not a performance. It was not forced calm layered over something else. It was structural, as if the surrounding chaos was a surface he was standing on rather than something trying to swallow him. The 6th Battalions pressed forward. For a time, the engagement developed exactly as the Keth operational assessment projected. The human positions compressed, the outer left flank began to bend under the concentrated pressure. I watched it happen in real time, and the trained part of my thinking could see the end point clearly. Then I saw the gap. A Keth unit had pushed through the compressed flank and cut off a small forward group, 4 humans, and isolated position, no direct line back to the main body. By the time I registered the full picture, the gap had closed behind them. The tactical model I carried produced a timeline for their situation without being asked. The timeline was short. I had the human command net frequency. I had been given it for observation purposes. I looked at the frequency for a very short time. Then I transmitted position of the isolated group, precise coordinates, the gap location, approach angle, the available timing window. Before that window closed, everything the human command structure needed to reach them. I want to say something about the decision I made in that moment, and I want to say it as precisely as I can, because I have thought about it across a great many cycles since. It was not a slow decision. It did not feel like a crossroads with 2 clearly marked paths. It felt like reaching for something that was already in my hand. I have asked myself many times whether that troubles me. It does not. The 4 humans were extracted. This is documented. The advance did not overrun the human position. By mid-morning, the Keth commanders recalculated, reformed. The operational assessment was revised, and then the revision was revised. By mid-afternoon, the ridge was still held. At the close of the day, Sovereignty Supreme Command issued a signal for a temporary operational halt pending revised tactical analysis. I was inside the human perimeter when the signal came through. I am not certain of the exact moment I stopped being outside it. I know it was before the transmission. I believe it was before the advance itself began. I think if I commit to precision, it was on the 2nd night of the shortage, in the dark, when Nina Fletcher said, "I already made the other choice." I sat on the ground near the radio. The song had changed. I did not know this one either. I sat there for a long time. The interview room is plain. The table is a standard commission configuration. The recording equipment is an older model than the one currently in use by the Sovereignty. I have noted this without drawing conclusions from it. The water on the table beside me has not been touched. I have been in this room for several hours now, answering questions about dates, coordinates, troop movements, transmission frequencies, and the specific content of specific orders issued by specific Keth commanders. I have answered all of those questions accurately. I have been thorough and precise. I have given the commission everything it asked for. There is a pause now. The interviewer looks down at the document in front of them, then back at me. "Is there anything you would like to add?" they say, "beyond the tactical record?" I look at my hands for a moment. I do this without deciding to. I have been doing this throughout the session. It is not something my species does naturally. I noticed it 3 interviews ago and have not been able to stop. Yes, I say I believe there is. I think about where to start. The honest answer is that there is no clean starting point, because the thing I need to describe is not an event, it is a change. Changes do not have starting points, they have accumulation, small additions of evidence, each one small enough to dismiss individually until there are enough of them that dismissal is no longer structurally possible. But if I had to choose one moment that carries the weight of all the others, inside it would be a boot still tied in its perfect double knot, sitting just inside the threshold of a field station that should not have been operating. I stood over it for 42 seconds. I was at that point a being of very high confidence. I had my models. I had 500 cycles of Keth intelligence literature telling me exactly how organic species behave under sustained stress. The answer across all of it was consistent. They break along predictable lines. You identify the lines, you apply the appropriate pressure, and the breaking is a matter of time and patience and nothing more complicated than that. I believe this completely, without reservation. I stood over that boot and the first fracture formed in that belief, and I wrote human equipment notable and told myself I was moving on. I was not moving on. The fracture was there. Everything that came after entered it and made it wider. Not dramatically, not in a single moment of revelation. The way water finds its path through stone, steady, patient, indifferent to how long it takes. Garrett running forward on a wounded shoulder because the situation had made him angry, and 4 other people following him without hesitation, and a larger and better positioned Keth unit withdrawing from a species that was not supposed to be capable of that kind of pressure. A photograph of 2 small humans in front of a bare tree, carried inside body armor in a laminated square that had been handled so many times the edges had worn soft. Nina Fletcher in the dark saying, I already made the other choice. Cal Reeves eating something barely edible and calling it acceptable because Pete needed the better option. And the math on that was simply obvious to him. A radio playing a song that nobody turned off in the middle of everything, because turning it off would have required a moment's attention that belonged to something else, and also because I think, and I cannot verify this, but I think the sound of it meant something to them that had nothing to do with music and everything to do with the specific texture of normal life, and they were not ready to let go of that texture even then. I have been asked many times across many interviews whether I believe the humans held the ridge because they possessed superior tactical capabilities. They did not. I have been asked whether they held it because their technology was more advanced. It was not more advanced. I have been asked whether they held it because they felt no fear. I have the biochemical field logs from 11 days of close observation. The fear was present throughout, elevated and continuous. I measured it carefully. The fear was real. What I came to understand, sitting on the ground beside a radio I had never thought to turn off, is that the fear measurements were accurate and also entirely beside the point. The humans were afraid. They had decided at some point before the fear arrived, each of them individually, without coordination, without a policy directive or a command-level order, that the fear was not going to be the factor that determined what they did next, not because they were braver than other species, not because their biology processed fear differently, because each of them had already made a different decision about the person beside them, about a photograph inside their armor, about the people somewhere else who were waiting for them to come back. And when the fear arrived and looked for a place to settle, it found the decision already occupying the space, over and over, ridge after ridge, for the whole of human history, if I understand it correctly, already made the other choice. After the halt order came through, I was extracted by the human command structure. I use the word extracted deliberately. I did not request it. They came anyway. I was moved to a staging area, then transferred under conditions I will not detail to this commission, to a neutral processing zone, and eventually to the series of rooms and interviews that led to this one. The Keth sovereignty issued a formal classification of my status shortly after my departure: defector, observation asset, probable coercion scenario. I read this classification, the transcript of my own sovereignty debrief, and spent some time being genuinely impressed by its tidiness. The coercion framing is elegant. It gives the sovereignty something they can work with, a narrative that does not require them to examine anything uncomfortable about why an observer who had spent 60 days watching humans would make the choices I made. I was not coerced. I made a transmission. Then I sat on the ground and listened to a song I did not know until it ended. The commission has asked me about each member of Third Squad. I will answer this the way I have answered everything. Nina Fletcher was rotated home approximately 3 weeks after the Ridge engagement. I was told she had family there. I have not attempted to contact her. I have thought about what I would say if I did, and I have not yet found language adequate to whatever that conversation would need to be. What she said to me in the dark on the second night of the shortage deserves, I think, to remain where it was said. Cal Reeves was promoted. Garrett attempted to block the promotion, citing what he described as Cal is too good at the part of the job that isn't command, and command will make him forget what that part feels like. The promotion went through anyway. Cal accepted it with the same expression he appeared to use for most things, the one that suggested he was mildly amused by life in general and not particularly surprised by any specific development within it. Pete Hollies is still serving. His current assignment is not information I have access to. I hope the conditions are dry. Danny Ward, who found none of my early answers satisfying and maintained that assessment consistently throughout our acquaintance, finished his tour and enrolled in an engineering program. Garrett told me this in the one communication we have exchanged since the Ridge. He described the development as good. I have thought about that word more than seems proportionate. It was the right word. It was exactly the right word in exactly the right quantity. Owen Garrett is still on a line somewhere. I have no more specific information than that, and I find that I do not know what to do with not knowing. I think about the photograph sometimes. The two small humans, the bare tree, the worn edges of the laminated square. I brought the field logs to this session, 60 days of observations. Discrepancy reports tactical assessments, and what I now understand were the detailed notes of a being in the process of becoming unable to be only what it had been trained to be. I have been told the Commission may wish to enter them as evidence. I find that today in this room I am not prepared to do that. I return them to my coat. The interviewer watches me do this without objecting. Then they ask the question I have been waiting for since the session began. Varath 7, they say, do you consider yourself an enemy of the Keth sovereignty? I have prepared this answer, many versions of it, the precise version, the diplomatic version, the legally defensible version, the version my counsel recommended. I know all of them well enough to deliver any of them cleanly. I deliver none of them. I consider myself, I say, someone who traveled to a ridge to observe a species in the process of collapsing. The room is quiet. I watched them for 60 days. I watched a sergeant run forward on a wounded shoulder because the engagement had made him angry, and I watched 4 people follow him without a word of discussion. And I watched a unit that had every material reason to be finished hold position that the best available analysis said could not be held. I look at the table. I watched a woman eat the worst available food without comment because the person beside her needed the better option more. I watched a man carry a photograph of his children inside his body armor and look at it after a firefight with an expression I have never been able to fully describe and have never stopped trying. I watched 4 members of a squad get cut off from their unit and recovered by people who had no formal obligation to go after them and went anyway without being asked, without hesitation. I look at my hands again, that gesture I cannot seem to stop. I watch a species that every model I carried told me breaks along psychological fault lines, hold a ridge with no resupply, no relief, and no rational mathematical justification for continued resistance. And what I came to understand, sitting on the ground inside a perimeter I had entered as an observer, is that they held it for the only reason that cannot be modeled. I let that sit. Each of them had already made a decision that the fear and the math and the shortage and the pressure arrived too late to change. Not once, not as a command directive, individually, repeatedly, in every moment that required it for as long as it was required. And when I transmitted those coordinates, I had been watching that happen closely enough and for long enough that I found I had made the same kind of decision without realizing I was making it. The interviewer has stopped writing. I am what I am now, I say, because 60 days of watching that kind of choosing leaves marks that do not come out. What the sovereignty does with that information is a decision I leave entirely to them. I pause. They are exceptionally skilled at classifying things, I say. I pick up the water that has been sitting beside me since the session began. I take a drink, a very human gesture I have apparently developed several of them. It is the holding, I say, that has always given them trouble. The recording equipment continues its quiet operation. The interviewer makes a final note. Outside the plane room somewhere, Ridge is being held by someone carrying a photograph, by someone who already made the other choice.